All right, fantastic, everyone. It is 4 o'clock. Welcome, everyone, to our COVID-19 vaccine webinar. My name is Jessica Cole, and I am a VEBA account manager. Thank you for taking the time to join us today to learn everything you're going to need to know about the COVID-19 vaccine, such as how it works, effectiveness, safety, and side effects. At VEBA, we remain steadfast in our commitment to support you in any way that we can. So before we begin, a few items of housekeeping. To help streamline the presentation, all participant lines are muted. If you have a question, please submit it through the Q&A function. For questions for the broader group, they will be held until the end and then answered by our panelists. If you wish not to share your name, please click on the Send Anonymously when submitting your question. The presentation is being recorded and it will be available for you to view after the webinar tomorrow on our VEBA COVID-19 landing page. This webinar is intended to be general in nature and will not be addressing individual situations or issues with vaccine availability. For the latest news in your area or medical group, please visit vebaonline.com and click on the COVID-19 vaccination information button. The last few months have brought unprecedented and unanticipated changes to our daily lives. Our agenda today is focusing on the COVID-19 vaccine, the science behind the vaccine, effectiveness and safety of the vaccine, and some additional resources. We may not have all the answers today, but we will give you our best information so you can make informed decisions. For current COVID-19 vaccine information, please visit vebaonline.com and click on the COVID-19 vaccination information button. Please visit this landing page continually as information is changing constantly. I would now like to go ahead and introduce our presenter for today's webinar, Dr. Shane Crotty, a professor for the Infectious Disease and Vaccine Research at the La Jolla Institute for Immunology and world-renowned expert in vaccine design. COVID-19 research is being done at his lab and has informed vaccine efforts worldwide. Thank you, Dr. Crotty.
Hello, thanks for having me. I'll go ahead and get the slides up. All right, we all good? Let me just simplify that. There we go. Yeah, so I'm gonna talk to you about the COVID-19 vaccines and how they work. And to understand that, it helps to talk some about why people get sick with COVID-19 and what it means to be immune. Okay. Yeah, and just to comment. So I'm at the Jolla Institute for Immunology. It's a nonprofit research institute on the University of California, San Diego campus here in San Diego, and everybody here works on aspects of the immune system. So vaccines work on the basis of immunity. They're about your immune system learning to recognize some new virus and then remembering that new virus. And frequently that's very similar to the vaccine trying to recapitulate what happens when you actually get infected with the virus, but without having to have the infection. And so it's helpful to understand things about the infection itself. And so I'm gonna talk you through some things about how your immune system works and how your body responds to COVID-19, and then talk through the vaccines and various questions people frequently have about the vaccines. My lab and the lab of Professor Alex Setti here at LJI have made a number of contributions to understanding COVID-19, and this is the sort of first big scientific paper that we had on this to help understand the disease, and it got a lot of attention, including here's a live action shot of our scientific paper being held up by Tony Fauci in Congress to explain COVID and the immune system to congressmen. So we were, I'll say, we were really excited when that happened. That was a big moment for us. So I actually, I didn't do much Twitter at the time, but so a tweet from me that was popular would get like 10 likes, you know. But I tweeted this out and said, you know, I should just have business cards made that are just this photo, and that became a very popular tweet. So I thought I'd share with you a couple of fun replies. First of all, lots of people said I should retire because that was as good as it was going to get, you know, having that happen. And I'll say that my wife did not agree. and she said, you know, I think Tony Fauci actually specifically said you had more work to do, which was true. But people made nice GIFs for us of of this. And my favorite reply was from a woman who wrote back, I suggest printing it out onto a custom blanket and cradle yourself in sweet validation every night, which is pretty fun. So why did this paper on COVID-19, why did these discoveries get so much attention? Well, early in 2020, there was a lot of fear and uncertainty about whether or not people develop immunity to COVID-19 at all. And that was important broadly, and also important for vaccine development. Because most vaccines work against viruses that people do develop natural immunity against also. And we thought it was likely that people did develop immunity because COVID-19 is an acute infection that resolves or cures in most people, right? And so usually that's an indication of an infection where somebody's getting infected, they're getting sick, but then their immune system kicks in and kills off the virus, okay? And so we felt the best way to understand this quickly was to take people who had average cases of COVID-19, so people who got sort of flu-like symptoms but got better, and ask what kind of immune responses did they make? Because those were probably people who made successful immune responses to kill off this virus. And those immune responses could help inform vaccine development and could help tell us whether or not it was likely to be a hard vaccine to develop or not. Okay. And your immune system really consists of three different parts. There are antibodies, which probably most of you have heard of that, but then there are T cells, and there are actually two kinds of T cells, helper T cells and killer T cells. And these three different parts of your immune system have different jobs, and actually they're a lot like branches of the military, where they are different, and they tend to be better at battles in some locations versus others, but they can also work together to accomplish things that any given branch can't on their own, okay? So antibodies are frequently important in vaccines. Helper T cells, as sort of their name applies, they help do various things in immune responses. So they're key to get antibody responses, and they can also do antiviral activities on their own. And then killer T cells kill off infected cells. So basically, antibodies are good at stopping viruses outside of cells, but once a virus infects a cell, antibodies generally can't do very much. And instead, you need killer T cells to go find those infected cells and kill them. So these are complementary functions. And what we asked was, well, these are the three main parts of your immune system. Does your body make all three of those after a novel coronavirus infection in COVID-19? Okay. And so we did that because we have the expertise here at LJI to measure all three of those at the same time. And we did this in, again, average cases of COVID-19 because we felt like, for one, those were average cases, and for two, those were probably people who were making successful immune responses. And this came out in May And this was really good news because everybody made an antibody response, everybody made a helper T cell response, and most people made a killer T cell response. So that was good news. And there were various other things about it that looked good in terms of the quality of the immune response. And additionally, most of the vaccines were directed against the spike protein S, which is just one part of coronavirus. And our data indicated that in an infection, spike is a good target of antibody responses, but it's also a good target of T cell responses. So that was also good news for vaccine development that that a vaccine that just had this protein was still likely to generate an immune response that looked similar to a natural infection. Okay. And we then followed that up with a second study. Obviously, novel coronavirus infections, SARS-CoV-2 infections, have a range of disease outcomes. Some people have asymptomatic disease. Some people have essentially flu-like symptoms. Some people get hospitalized. Some people end up in the ICU, and some people have fatal infections. So that's a broad range, and it's been complicated, confusing to understand why do people have different outcomes. And so in a second study summarized on this slide, what we did was we again measured those three parts of immune responses. But this time, instead of looking at people with average cases, we looked at a lot of people who had severe cases or were hospitalized and had a range of disease outcomes. And what we observed was that people who had coordinated immune responses, people who made all three branches of immune responses, tended to do pretty well with the infection. Whereas people who had very weak infections, weak immune responses, adaptive immune responses, the T cells and antibodies, tended to have poor outcomes. And notably, older individuals were more likely to have poor immune responses. And this was connected with the fact that actually older people tend to have fewer T cells to start with. And so they just have a harder time making an immune response to a brand new viral infection. And so we could take that data and all kinds of other data and put together a model for understanding this infection. Okay. And I'll briefly walk you through this because it does connect to understanding a COVID-19 vaccine. So in a normal viral infection, you actually have two general parts of your immune system. The part that I was talking about is formally called the adaptive immune system, and that's the T cells and the antibodies. That's the part of your immune system that can very specifically learn about and recognize a new viral infection. But there's also the innate immune response that just can sort of generally recognize if there's a viral infection or a bacterial infection. And a normal response would look something like this. For any virus that can cause disease in humans, the virus has to have some immune evasion mechanism usually to make people sick. And it's frequently important to understand that, to understand the disease. And so it's pretty clear that at least one big trick of SARS-2 is that it's very stealthy about evading setting off an initial innate immune response. So this is really sort of the fire alarm or the burglar alarm of the immune system. And this virus, novel coronavirus, is, again, stealthy at avoiding triggering what are called early type 1 interferon responses. So as a result, the virus gets a head start on your immune system. And it turns out that you're, well, I'll just leave it at that. But in an average case, the virus gets a head start, but then your immune system can catch up and make T cell and antibody responses that can kill off the virus, either before you get sick at all, and so that's really an asymptomatic infection, or after you've gotten somewhat sick, but not super sick, and that would be sort of the flu-like symptoms. Okay, and so people ask, well, why? And this usually takes about a week to get a T cell or an antibody response, and people frequently ask, well, why is that? And so I'll come back to this in a minute. And that's because the genius of your immune system is that you have billions of cells in your immune system that have the potential to recognize potentially any virus that has ever existed or ever will exist. Okay. They recognize all kinds of possible molecular structures. But while that's a brilliant solution, so somewhere in your body, there are cells that can recognize novel coronavirus and kill it off. Okay. But the downside of that is that they're rare. There's only a handful of cells in your body that can do this. And so, you know, like on this page of 10,000 cells, it's just this one cell that can do the job. Okay. So that's a problem. So when you get infected, there's just the one cell and it has to divide like crazy. It has to grow like crazy until it's generated enough cells, like 1,000 cells, to actually then be able to kill off the virus. And so that's actually why you get sick for a while before your immune system controls the infection and you get better. You know, it'd take a long time for you to divide 1,000 times, right? So the cells divide as quickly as they can, but it still takes a while for them to divide and create 1,000 progeny. And so that's why it usually takes like a week to get a T cell and antibody response to actually stop the virus. Well, the brilliance of vaccines is a vaccine does exactly the same thing, but it does it all before you get infected. So a vaccine stimulates that rare cell in your body that can recognize and stop this virus, goes ahead and gets that cell to grow and generate lots of it and generate lots of antibodies, these T cells and antibody responses in parallel, so that when you get exposed to the virus, you've already got T cells and antibodies. You don't have to wait a week to get an immune response. You've already got them at time zero. So you can completely stop the viral infection instantly or stop it very briefly, so you never get sick. Okay. In a severe SARS-2 infection, this is just a duplication of this so that you can look at it vertically if you want. As I said, the one big trick of this virus appears to be it's very stealthy early on. And so the simplest model is that a severe SARS-2 infection, one that puts people in the hospital or kills them, is the same type of thing, but extended further out. So instead of the virus hiding from the innate immune system for a while, it hides for a really long time. And as a result, the immune system seeing it too late and the virus has too much of a head start on the immune system. And then severe disease gets pretty complicated. It's still controversial about exactly what it means, but in brief, there is inflammation in severe disease, and that looks like it's really about the innate immune system because it looks like people are actually failing to make a good enough T cell response to stop the virus. So the innate immune system just kind of does what it can in the absence of a successful T cell response. And that can work for a while, but in the end, it causes too much damage to the lungs. And that this is more common in older individuals who have fewer T cells to start with, okay? For vaccines, that again is actually good news because if the problem is you're making a T cell response that's too slow or too small, well, the whole great thing about a vaccine, again, is that you can do all that with the vaccine before you get infected. So that with the vaccine, you have all this immunity at time zero. And so you've got a good chance of preventing the severe disease because you get a big head. Instead of the virus having the head start, you have the head start. Instead of your immune system starting from just this one cell, you have the head start and you've made lots of these cells. Okay. So those are the big concepts in place about how your body fights off COVID-19 and how a vaccine in general would help. A final topic about this is immune memory. All vaccines work because not only do you have to make an immune response, you have to grow the cells, but then the immune system has to remember the infection, okay, or remember the virus. And so lots of people were worried that there wasn't immune memory to this virus. And so we actually just published this month a big paper in Science. It's the biggest paper ever done, biggest study ever done on immune memory in humans. So here's some of the data on it, which I just put up to show you. We did a lot of work. There was 188 people, most of them Californians actually, and we measured a lot of things about immune memory. And the take-home message was that actually 6 months after a COVID infection, about 95% of people actually still had a lot of immune memory against the virus, and they had multiple types of immune memory that looked pretty good and suggest that immunity against serious infections would likely last years. Okay. Yeah. And so the expectation has been at least some COVID-19 vaccines would be able to generate that same type of memory. Okay. So now we switch to the vaccines. Um, so how good do they look? Well, um, it's good to have a general idea about vaccines, okay, before thinking about COVID vaccines. Vaccines are extraordinary. Vaccines are the only medicine recommended for every healthy person on the planet, okay? That's how good they are. And here's my favorite graph of vaccines. This is actually all 50 states, and these are years. And measles was rampant in the United States and caused a lot of illness and serious injury to people. And then here's when the vaccine was introduced, and here's what happened to measles around the country thereafter, right? It just, the vaccine completely crushed it. And in fact, one of the amazing things about vaccines is you don't even know that the vaccine saved you, because vaccines generally work so well that you never get sick. So you don't know that the vaccine saved you. And the measles vaccine is estimated to save like 14 million lives in the past 10 years. And basically none of those people, in general, those people don't even know, right, that their life was saved because the vaccine worked so incredibly well. I gave a talk on vaccines, at a middle school, my daughter's middle school, a couple years ago, and it's really hard to convey big numbers to people and kids, and it's also hard to teach how well vaccines have worked over the 20th century, because life is so different now. And so I actually made up little cards with little drawings of different diseases on them and gave them out to all the kids. And when I talked about different diseases, I would have them hold up the cards so that it would be clear that, and we pretended it was basically 1902, over 100 years ago, before there were almost any vaccines. Because at the time, it would have been that like 40% of the class would have died from these childhood infections, which are now prevented by vaccines, those are extraordinary numbers, or paralyzed by polio and these types of things. So measles vaccines can be phenomenally effective. For COVID, what's the expectation? Well, our data and other data have indicated it's not that hard of a virus for a vaccine to stop. That's one of the take-home messages that people had from our data and some important animal model studies in monkeys. And so there have been a lot of different vaccines that have been tested, and I'm just going to focus on the approved ones today, which are really the two RNA vaccines, okay, the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines. There's a big J&J vaccine going on that should have some sort of news in the next couple of weeks. But for the moment, these are the two that are approved, okay? And here's the data from one of those two big clinical trials. So 2020 was horrible in many ways, but it was a phenomenal year for medicine in that it was the first year ever when there were multiple successful vaccine trials in the same calendar year, including two, the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, that were incredibly effective, 95% effective against disease. And so this is a graph of everybody who was enrolled in that clinical trial, right? So 40,000 people. And here are the cases of COVID-19 in the people who got the placebo, the people who did not get the vaccine, okay? And then here are the cases in the people who got the vaccine. 95% effective from this point out, all right? That's incredible. That's a really good effect. And the Moderna vaccine basically gave identical results. So totally independent clinical trials, virtually identical outcomes, really good news. And just to be clear, this is 95% effective against getting sick. That's the benchmark, getting sick at all, okay? They're essentially 100% effective against severe disease, i.e. getting hospitalized. And so some people hear 95% effective and they think, oh, well, 5% of the time it doesn't work at all. That's not correct. Vaccines are generally like car brakes, okay? Vaccines are like car brakes in that if you're gonna have a rear end collision, right, with a car, if you don't have any brakes at all, right, you completely slam into that other car and completely mangle the back of that car. Vaccines are like brakes where you hit the brakes, and even if you still hit that other car, right, the brakes were doing something, right, and we're probably doing a lot, and so you end up just denting the other fender, right, or getting a scratch, and that's generally what vaccines do here. Even in the people who did still get infected, it was a much milder thing, like just getting, you know, a fender scratched or dented instead of getting very serious illness. So I'm going to go through some of the safety topics of the vaccine and a couple of the common questions. About the vaccines. It's very normal for there to be vaccine hesitancy when there's a new vaccine. In this case, there was hesitancy before there was any approved vaccine at all. It was quite normal because you really want people to want to see the data, right, before being interested and willing in taking a vaccine. And so it's a new thing. Like in any new vaccine, take some time to communicate and let people know what the data look like and what the safety look like. And so I love that people have been highlighting in the news that this totally happened with the polio vaccine as well. And there was vaccine hesitancy. And then Elvis got vaccinated on TV on the Ed Sullivan show. And then everybody was fine with getting the vaccine thereafter. And our modern day versions of that are various things, but including presidents getting vaccinated on TV. Joe Biden got his vaccine on TV, just a few days ago. And for us Californians, our former governor Arnold Schwarzenegger got vaccinated a few days ago and videotaped it at a big vaccination center. So that was great to see as well. And in fact, there have been now millions of people who've been vaccinated, which we'll come back to. One source of people deciding or people saying that they're not going to get vaccinated is that they're not worried about COVID-19, and usually that's because of a lot of misinformation that was around this past year and propagated from various sources, basically claiming that people under the age of 65 are totally safe from COVID-19. That's not true at all. So half of hospitalizations in America have been people under the age of 65. Okay, so there've been over 1 million Americans under the age of 65 who have been hospitalized with disease, and in fact, half of those people are under the age of 50. And this is obviously hospitalization is a very serious outcome, and so people under the age of 65 very much should get vaccinated as soon as it's possible for them to get vaccinated. Okay. I worked just about every day in 2020, and on Thanksgiving Day, I was trying to take the day off with my family. And I failed because I decided to write some tweets about vaccine safety, because I thought, it was important to do that outreach, because people have been concerned about RNA vaccines because they're a new kind of vaccine, and are they safe? And so I wrote some tweets about that. I'll talk you through them real quickly. They got viewed millions of times within 24 hours and have been very popular. So first, what is RNA? So some people have gotten worried about RNA vaccines because they were told that they were genetic immunizations, and thinking that it was genetic engineering, and that's not true. That's incorrect. So RNA is a molecule that's messages. At any given moment, a human cell has 5,000 different, one cell, any given cell in your body, okay, has 5,000 different RNAs in it. And each of those RNAs are a temporary message. It's like a Post-it note that has an instruction written on it inside your cell, every cell with like 5,000 of these Post-it notes, telling the cell what to do, what it needs to build, where it needs to go, okay? But they're temporary. And actually, each of those messages gets torn up within minutes or hours. RNA is a temporary molecule. Or if you prefer the digital version, RNA is like Snapchat. They're messages that expire. These vaccines do not become a permanent part of your body. These RNA vaccines are temporary messages instructing cells to make one viral protein temporarily. So the way this works is for your immune system. Remember those rare cells in your body, right? That have to recognize the virus. Well, for the vaccine, the way it works is the RNA is a message for that one single coronavirus protein, the spike protein. And so that protein is going to get shown to your immune system and teach your immune system how to control it. Okay. Also, it takes 25 different coronavirus proteins to make a coronavirus. So there's no worry about the RNA making a new virus. Okay. It's basically like you imagine some car that's in 25 parts, right? And so you've got the shell of the car, but you took off all the wheels and you took out the engine. There's no way it's going to drive off, but it can show your body what the shape of a car looks like. And in terms of safety, over 70,000 doses of these RNA vaccines were given to people, and this was before, this is back in November for the clinical trials. And it's independent safety boards that review that safety data. That's an incredible amount of safety data. That's probably the most safety data for any vaccine ever before it got approval to go forward into people. And that's because to go fast with these clinical trials, they were very large clinical trials to make sure that they would have enough people in them to see enough COVID cases. So actually, as a bonus there's a huge amount of safety data, a much bigger population of people than usual in these trials. And this is out of date now. I just left it because it was part of that. We have seen the full safety data, and the safety data look fantastic. Lastly, so it's important to recognize safe does not mean the same thing as did not hurt at all or no fever for a little while. Okay, there's a big distinction. Vaccines are safe in that they don't cause any serious outcomes, but in terms of hurting some or having a sore arm or having a bit of a fever overnight, that can definitely happen with good vaccines, and that's actually frequently a positive thing. The immune system generally remembers things better if they were something of an insult. And so it's really not unlike going to the gym and getting exercise and really sore muscles, and that's a training regimen. A bit of pain can be a positive sign that good things are happening. So it's really sort of an earning your immunity situation with a vaccine when you're trying to protect yourself against a serious disease. So that was that one too. Here's a schematic of a really nice diagram of how an RNA vaccine works. So here it is. It's a piece of, so this is what the actual virus would look like. And instead of having a virus, it's just a piece of RNA that can encode the spike protein. And it's in a lipid coating, essentially like tiny little butter droplets, essentially, to just contain the RNA. And that gets injected, and those deliver the RNA into cells in your body. Okay. And so those RNAs are messages. Like I said, they're messages, right? And what the messages encode are that one viral protein. And so your body is going to get taught what that one viral protein looks like. So your immune system gets to see that one viral protein. And now those rare cells in your immune system will grow up into lots and lots of cells that can now protect you against the virus. And then the RNAs degrade away, and that's fine. So another important question from people is vaccine trial diversity. And I was very happy that these were some of the most inclusive vaccine trials ever, probably the most inclusive vaccine trials ever. There was a very active effort, certainly to have a wide age range and have good representation of men and women, but a very active effort to make sure that there were substantial numbers of Latinos and Black people in these clinical trials, so that there were enough to tell that the vaccines did work in these populations. And in fact, the vaccines basically work equally effectively in all of these groups. If anything, in some subgroups, the vaccines seem to work even better. So that's really been great news from the vaccines. Additionally, pregnant women are excluded from phase 3 clinical trials almost always. That's just a normal policy. But as happens in large clinical trials, there are some accidental pregnancies that occur. And so there were actually several hundred pregnancies that occurred in these clinical trials. And so they had enough data to be able to be quite confident, even in these first clinical trials, that there's no effect of the vaccine on pregnancy or fertility. And so the FDA agreed, actually for the first time ever for a trial like this, because of the size of the trial and the data and the emergency use authorization, that pregnant women can receive the vaccine if they wish to, at the advice of their doctor. You always want to know about your own personal situation, but that's that. So that's those. Then in terms of who should get the vaccine and why, well, it's important to protect yourself, but it's also important to protect your community. And so Tony Fauci, here in my favorite photo of Tony Fauci holding up my scientific paper, has said very clearly that everybody should get vaccinated, as soon as they can, because herd immunity with the vaccine is very important. By having a large number of people vaccinated, you can stop the virus from spreading. And I really appreciated that faith leaders have been saying similar things. And here's one faith leader, the Pope, specifically saying this past month, I believe that ethically everyone should take the vaccine. He grew up in Brazil, right, where there were lots of cases of all kinds of infections. And he remembers how incredible the effects of the polio vaccine were at the time at saving children. Or to phrase it a different way, getting immunized is the kind thing to do. It helps you, but it also helps your loved ones, your neighbors, and your community, because keeping yourself from having the virus also helps prevent spread to other people who may be around. I think this might be my final slide. Vaccinating kids, particularly given the audience of educators, I want to be clear. Vaccine development for kids is different than adults. It does take a significant amount of time, because almost always the dose has to change, and there has to be some guessing about what the right dose is. And it's extra hard in COVID-19 because younger kids have no symptoms. And so it's much harder to run a clinical trial on people who don't develop symptoms if they get infected. So it'll probably be 2022 before kids under the age of 12 qualify for COVID-19 vaccines, okay? And it's possible it'll take that long even for kids age 12 to 15. Right now, the Pfizer vaccine is approved for kids 16 and up, but the Moderna vaccine isn't. So really there's, even if supplies were unlimited, it would still be only some 16 and up would get it. They have started, both of these have started early trials for ages 12 to 15, but it's just ongoing, and it's not clear how those will turn out. Even if those do work, they have to go back and do the whole thing all over again for kids 6 to 12. And so again, it's going to be quite a while. Adults are basically all going to be vaccinated well before kids, and so it's key to keep that in mind. So I just want to end by showing you my lab and the people who work with me to study this disease here at LJI, and I will stop there and be happy to answer questions. Yeah. Moderators, where should we start? Are you guys there? Oh, I thought somebody was going to moderate.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Crotty, for that presentation. Thank you so much. That was so much information that you provided us with. So at this time, I'll go ahead and address some questions that you may have. If you have a question, please submit it through the Q&A function. And then Dr. Crotty, I'll go ahead and reshare my screen. Perfect. All right, so it looks like we do have some questions here for you, Dr. Crotty. All right. So the first question is, if a person has an autoimmune disease, could the vaccine cause the body to have an adverse reaction to the vaccine? Or could the COVID-19 vaccine cause a person with an autoimmune disease to go into overdrive with antibodies and make the antibodies attack the thyroid or etc.?
Yeah, good question. In general, people with as is normal for phase 3 clinical trials, people with serious autoimmune diseases were excluded from the trial, and so there wasn't direct data on that. And it's been known for vaccines in the past that in general, people with autoimmune diseases can take vaccines, but it depends. It's definitely something that has to involve somebody's primary care physician about what their personal situation is and which autoimmune disease it is, because there are many different autoimmune diseases with different characteristics and different safety profiles. That's where it is right now for people with autoimmune diseases. The simplest problem that could occur is that the fact that a vaccine induces some inflammation, right, like the sore arm and possibly having a fever, could induce an autoimmune flare, right? You already have an autoimmune disease and it could at least temporarily exacerbate it, but that depends a lot on exactly what the person's autoimmune disease is and their personal history with it, balancing that against their personal risk of COVID-19.
Perfect. Thank you. Another question we have is, how long will the vaccine last? Will I need to be vaccinated every year, similar to that of the flu shot?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question, and the answer is we don't know. And the reasons we don't know is that immune memory, what I was telling you about, is hard to predict, and primarily you have to wait and see. So we just don't know how long immune memory will last with these RNA vaccines. There's initial data that suggested that immune memory to them will last a year, and I think there's a reasonable expectation that probably people will require, well, there's definitely the possibility, let's say that, the possibility that people will require a booster immunization after 12 months, just to boost back up their immune response if the memory has faded away. But it's an unknown right now for the RNA vaccines, how long that memory lasts. It's a great question. Definitely for a period of months, it looks like they're going to give fantastic protective immunity, but whether it'll last for a year, 2 years, or 3 years is unknown at the moment. Yeah, good question.
Perfect. And have you yourself been vaccinated yet?
Yeah, good question. So my parents and my wife's parents both live in San Diego, and my sister's husband's parents also live in San Diego. And now all 6 of them have been vaccinated. They're all over the age of 70. And since I run a COVID lab, my tier just opened that I was, since we have COVID samples in the lab, they just opened it up a few days ago. So yeah, I got immunized yesterday, right there.
Perfect. If you have had COVID-19 and have recovered, do you need to get vaccinated?
Yeah, great question. There are, at the moment, there are different recommendations on that. So the official CDC recommendation. So the CDC has, right, the CDC has fully authorized these vaccines. These are good to go. But recommendations for different subpopulations, the recommendations will change as information becomes available. And so the formal recommendation by the CDC right now is that essentially everyone should get vaccinated as soon as they can, independent of whether or not they've had COVID before. Tony Fauci actually said on TV a couple weeks ago that he would recommend waiting 90 days after COVID before getting vaccinated. And that's because after infection, essentially he was thinking somebody's immunity might be so high that it might keep the vaccine from working and that you might have to wait a while for the vaccine to kick in. And the New England Journal of Medicine has made somewhat similar recommendations. Other scientists have made, and public health officials have made informal recommendations at this point, that perhaps waiting 6 months after COVID infection would be reasonable just from a public health standpoint, to let that immunity come down. So I expect those recommendations will continue to change, or might change over the next month or two, as to whether someone should wait 3 months or 6 months before getting immunized. So yeah, that's the current information.
Wonderful. And a general question about the flu versus a COVID-19 vaccine. Can you compare if if people have been told not to get a flu vaccine, does that also apply to COVID?
Oh, great question. No, it for the most part doesn't. Usually, a lot of the recommendations against the flu vaccine relate to egg allergies, because classic flu vaccines, turns out, are grown in eggs, and that's totally unrelated to the COVID vaccine. Yeah.
Perfect. And is it safe for women who are breastfeeding to get the vaccine?
Yes, I just retweeted somebody on Twitter within the past couple of days who had a really nice summary, of the available info for that. But yes, the answer is yes. If anything, it's great, because breastfeeding will transfer antibodies to the baby as well. So it's usually a positive.
Perfect. And after getting the first dose, can you still be considered a carrier?
Yes, definitely. So that's why essentially the maximal immunity starts something like 7 days after the second dose. Okay, and so there's actually there's data from the clinical trials, and there's also data now from quote unquote real world in Israel, where Israel is the first country to massively vaccinate people, particularly people over the age of 60, and so they could see already the past week or two, that it looks like some protection starts at about 14 days after immunization. So partial protection happens at about 2 weeks, and then full protection occurs after the second immunization. But in the interim, yeah, you could still get infected or be a carrier.
Gotcha. Now, is there a way that you could discuss the ingredients and any allergic reactions and who should not get the vaccine?
Yeah. So the ingredients really are the RNA and the lipid, and it turns out the lipid is conjugated to a molecule called PEG to actually just stabilize it. It's and PEG's in all kinds of stuff, including toothpaste. But that's it. That's like the total list of ingredients. It's literally those two molecules, the RNA and the lipid. The recommendation for people with allergies is, in general, the vaccine's fine. It's talk with if you have serious allergies, you should talk with your primary care physician before you get the vaccine. And otherwise, it's recommended to get vaccinated and then be observed afterwards for allergic reactions. Really, the primary contradiction is if somebody gets vaccinated with the first dose and has an allergic reaction, to then not get the second dose. Okay, so it's pretty straightforward. And currently, what are the rates? It's 1 in 100,000 people who have been vaccinated so far have had a serious allergic reaction, which is a very low frequency of people. And all of those people, an EpiPen resolved it same day. So there are rare allergic reactions, and they've all been resolved quickly. And there are very good numbers on that, because those reactions happen quickly.
Gotcha. Now, does it matter which vaccine you get, whether the Pfizer or Moderna?
You get the one that's offered. and that's what I said about myself, that I would take whichever one was offered. They're essentially identical. As it happened, my day here in San Diego happened to be a Moderna day. And I think at least one of my parents got Pfizer. Yep, they're essentially identical. They're still recommending that you get the same one for your second immunization as your first, just because that's what was directly shown in the clinical trials. But people are expressing some flexibility even about that because they've been so comparable.
Perfect. Thank you. Now, other than protection against COVID-19, are there any other benefits to getting vaccinated?
No, I mean, like what?
Gotcha. No, but once you have been vaccinated, do you even still need to wear a mask?
Oh, like stuff like that. So the current recommendations are, for one, to certainly be wearing a mask after your first immunization because you're not immune yet. Okay. And for two, most public health officials are still recommending wearing a mask even after the second immunization because there's no proof yet of the virus preventing transmission, i.e., whether people could still be infected and not get sick and then transmit to other people. I think the data that have been coming out, both from the clinical trials and actually from Israel this past week, are indicating that it looks like the vaccine is quite good at minimizing and preventing infections. And so it's likely to turn out that the vaccines are very good at preventing transmission, but all the data isn't in place yet. Did that make sense? Do I need to explain that differently?
Nope, that makes great sense. Thank you so much. And what is a reasonable timeline for getting the second dose? What is considered too late for a second shot?
Nothing is considered too late for a second shot. So that's a great question. And essentially all of these have been great questions and important questions. These vaccine schedules were chosen to try and get people immune as fast as possible. Okay. And so the Pfizer is a day 0, week 3, and the Moderna is a day 0, week 4. If for some reason you're unable to get the second dose until week 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, your immunity after that second immunization is highly likely to be just as good as if you had gotten the vaccine just on time. Okay. There's a lot of vaccine immunology that's seen for other vaccines and other experimental situations that if anything, immunity gets a little better if you wait a little longer. Okay. So like essentially, I guess the other way to answer it is whether you get the second immunization at a month or at 2 months, 6 months after whenever that second immunization is, your immunity is going to be identical either way. And it's just the goal is to get that second immunization as fast as possible so you get full immunity as quick as possible, because the one immunization is not as good as 2 immunizations.
Perfect. Thank you. Now, if I test positive before getting the second dose, should I still get the second dose? And how does that impact the effectiveness?
So that's a great question. That one, I don't think I know the answer to. So in terms of testing positive, that would have to be a PCR test. Okay. So if somebody tests positive for antibody, that could be the vaccine making them antibody positive. But if you tested positive by PCR, suggesting you got infected right shortly after you got the vaccine, so the vaccine hadn't had time to kick in yet, I don't know that there is a recommendation right now about the second immunization. Yeah.
Gotcha. Now, can you speak a little bit on the new strands of COVID and the effectiveness of the vaccine on them?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I can. First, I guess tying back to some of the earlier questions you asked, I know that some people have asked about what about I talked about some side effects, and people asked about, what about long-term side effects of the vaccines? And that is a good question. And people have said, well, wasn't this these vaccines were developed so fast, do we have enough safety data? And that's exactly the question the FDA asked their panels of scientists and public health people as well. How much safety data do we need? How much time of safety data do we need to know if there would be rare or longer term side effects? And so they went and looked at all the available vaccines and decades and decades of data, and they said 2 months. You need 2 months of safety data to be able to tell. By then, you can tell if there are any serious side effects, and so that's what was actually required. And yeah, now there's safety data out to basically 6 months, and yeah, it's all looking the same. The very good safety observations made in the phase 3 clinical trials have been carrying out in common practices as well. And yeah, and that's why the FDA and the CDC approved them. Really, in terms of the speed of the vaccine, mostly the speed things were things that money could solve. Usually, people wouldn't start manufacturing a vaccine or doing different phase clinical trials until they'd already completed one, because it's risky to invest money into something until it's past each step. And there are 4 different steps in the development process. So normally it's step 1 and then pause, step 2 and then pause, and then you don't even start manufacturing until it's all done. But people realized that with this incredible pandemic, right, with 3,000, 4,000 people a day dying in the US, I mean, this incredible death toll, that we really needed to do things as quickly as possible. And so the thing that money could solve was to go ahead and pay for the manufacturing before the vaccines were ready. And so, in fact, manufacturing has been paid for vaccines that didn't succeed. And so that's just basically lost money, right? But the good thing was that the manufacturing money was invested also in vaccines that did succeed. And so after they succeeded in their clinical trials, didn't have to wait another year for manufacturing to scale up. All of that scale up money was spent in advance. So really, the speed things, which have been phenomenal, have really been the things that money could solve. Things like safety have had the exact same safety bars that have been required of other vaccines and other medicines. And like I said, 70,000 people, 70,000 doses of safety data is probably the most safety data ever for any vaccine. So, I mean, this really is, very rigorous clinical trials and very good broad safety data with, the most inclusive vaccine trials ever done.
Perfect, thank you. And our last question for today, do you need to quarantine after getting vaccinated or in between doses?
No.
Perfect. Gotcha. Perfect. Thank you. And thank you again, Dr. Crotty, for your presentation today, along with all the information you provided us about the COVID-19 vaccine. For further information, please visit our VEBAonline.com and click on the COVID-19 vaccination information button. If you have any additional questions, please contact the State of California COVID-19 Information Hotline at 833-422-4255. They are available to take your call Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. and Saturday through Sunday, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. You can even email them at covidcallcenter@cdph.ca.gov. This will conclude our webinar today. Thank you everyone again for attending our webinar. We hope that you take away a lot of information on the COVID-19 vaccine. Thank you again, Dr. Crotty. And please, everyone, stay safe and have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.